Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. I'm Sally Burden from Asia Bookroom, and I'm the owner of Asia Bookroom, and it's a pleasure to hold the launch here today for Hugh Tyndale-Biscoe's his latest book, and quite a different book, which you'll see over there, the Missionary and the Maharajas. Now, the launch this afternoon will take the form of an in-conversation between Dr Hugh Tyndale-Biscoe and Professor Tony Milner. And before I briefly introduce Hugh and Tony, I just thought I'd fill you in on how the afternoon will run. Hugh and Tony will shortly start a conversation about the book, after which they'll invite you to join in. And following this, we'll pack up the chairs and turn the place into an afternoon tea party. So at the back there'll be food and drink, the all-important. And during that time you'll have the opportunity to buy a book. I've always got to say that. I'm a bookseller. That's my job. And Hugh will be just here on those print and map drawers in the Japanese section signing. So, and I should just point out to you that Gay at the back and Madeline somewhere, they also will be around. Gay's waving a hand and Madeline's at the back there. They can also help you if you need anything. And I'd like to thank you for your contributions into the tin for the Indigenous Literacy Foundation. We raised quite a bit of money over the year with our events here, and they really do great work in remote communities. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce Hugh Tyndale-Biscoe and Tony Milner. Hugh was born in Kashmir, so it's very suitable, the third generation of the well-known British missionary family, and he attended the Tyndale-Biscoe school that his parents ran in Kashmir before finishing school in England. But he's been a Canberra resident since 1962, so one of those rare before-the-lake people, which is, it used to be a big marker of who you were in Canberra, whether you were before or after the lake, but I think people nowadays don't even know there wasn't a lake before. And as an adult, his interests lay with biology, and he is highly regarded for his marsupial research. During his career, he held many prestigious positions, including Chief Research Scientist, CSIRO Division of Wildlife and Ecology, between 1976 and 1995. And he's probably best known in the general community for his book, Life of Marsupials. And as I said, this one is the first move away from groups of marsupials. Yeah. Tony Milner was for 20 years Basham Professor of Asian History at the ANU, and he's specialised on Southeast Asia, particularly Malaysia and Indonesia, and on regional relations. And one of his interests has been the writings of Christian missionaries. So I think they have had many, many discussions about this book as it formed over the years. So without further ado, I will hand you over. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, this book, The Missionary and the Maharajas, is, I think, a fascinating book, and I'm going to say a couple of words about it to open this up this discussion. It's a study, as you'll pick up very quickly, of a missionary, Cecil Tyndale-Biscoe. That's Hugh's grandfather. It's a study of the work of missionaries in the British colonial period, and the events taking place in Kashmir come into it, and one gets a sense of that social and historical context. Now, Cecil Tyndale-Biscoe of the Church Missionary Society took over a school in Kashmir in 1890, and in different ways he and his son and his grandson, Hugh, have continued to be involved in the school until the present time. It's a successful school. The current principal of the Tyndale-Biscoe and the Mullinson schools has just written to send his best wishes for today's event, and he reports that there are, I think, 7,000 students at the school and 550 staff. And also the graduates of this school have held and continue to hold senior positions in Kashmir. Now, my interest in this book, apart from a desire to learn about Hugh's past and a wish to see how a marsupial biologist approaches the writing of history, my interest is in the way missionary sources can supplement official sources, government sources. Missionaries can give different perspectives on key figures and events. And we see here useful perspectives on Maharajas and even the religious interests of Maharajas, on viceroys and residents and politicians. And we learn too about Hindu-Muslim relations. Cecil Tyndale-Biscoe had advantages over the missionaries that I know best from research I've done, which were missionaries of the London Missionary Society. He was socially confident. He possessed private means. He mixed with people at all levels in the local society. He certainly mixed with the poor, but he also mixed with senior people in the Kashmir government, in the British government. So the book will be valuable, I think, for those who want to know more about Maharaja Hari Singh or Prime Minister Sheikh Abdullah or the extraordinary missionary C.F. Andrews. But the real interest in this book for me, and I suspect for others who read it, the thing that makes one want to keep reading the book is the focus on Cecil Tyndale-Biscoe himself. Hugh engages us in, I think, in a moral struggle throughout the book, a contradiction, a paradox. The more I read this book, the more I read it, the more I struggled to make a judgment about Cecil Tyndale-Biscoe. There's much that's quite unattractive about your grandfather. He uses force time and again. He was a boxer from his Cambridge days, and he threatened to box his opponents in an argument, and he threatened, he whipped people, and he told his teachers to whip people in order to get them to change their ways. He seems to be more concerned to reform Indian culture than to understand it. Yeah. Now, E.M. Forster, who we all know, called him a meddlesome and self-righteous, heartless and brainless and full of social and religious swank. Not so good. He was a contrast to his predecessor in Kashmir, a man called Knowles. He wanted to accommodate to native custom, as he put it, or he's also a contrast to that Anglican I mentioned before, about whom a good deal's been written, C.F. Andrews, who is described as embracing Hindu thinking, embracing Hindu culture. Andrews was also a supporter of Indian independence. And by contrast, Cecil joined Churchill's India Defence League of 1933, which opposed the handover of power to Indians. He was even tolerant of the harsh British methods employed in the Amritsar massacre of 1919. Now look, reading such attitudes, reading some of his own harsh actions, reading this today, it's difficult to avoid a sense of repugnance. Nevertheless, as you move through this book, as you move through it chapter by chapter, time and again, we encounter Cecil doing good and being seen to do good. He stimulates in his students a sense of self-respect. He's always after the creation of men of character. He quotes the John Stuart Mill about the importance of men of character in a society. He promotes a commitment to a service, to serving your community, even to fighting dangerous fires or to helping to clean up the city. Dirty work, usually forbidden to Brahmins. He encourages his students, in his words, to love their work more than rupees. Cecil campaigned effectively for the rights of women and of girls, for instance, to save them from child marriage. He's determined in preventing and in punishing harshly paedophilia. He sets up a fund for waifs and strays. Although he's passionate in wanting to change society, he doesn't focus on Christian conversions. He only had, in fact, one convert, right? One convert.
One Hindu and one Muslim.
Oh, got it, I didn't know about this. Now, in a religiously divided society, Hindu, Muslim, Cecil's teachings transcended the religious contest. And a later Kashmir Prime Minister put it, Sheikh Abdullah, he set an example of how a true relationship between two peoples, seemingly quite alien to each other, could be built on equal and human terms. Now, Hugh, it seems to me that you too must struggle to some extent to make a judgment about Cecil. You're not just using the paradox as a quite brilliant theme to excite the reader's interest and to drive forward the narrative. Reading this book recalls for me that great John Mulvaney, his own struggle in the study of an extraordinary Adelaide-born policeman, Ernest Cowell, whose methods could be brutal, but who displayed also a sympathetic and sensitive understanding of indigenous society in the centre of this continent. Mulvaney talked to me of how difficult it was for him to come to a judgment regarding this man. So, Hugh, can I draw you out a little on the business of how to judge Cecil Tyndale-Biscoe, and to start, if we can, just with the negatives. At times he seems so critical of the people in Kashmir that one wonders why he wanted to work there at all. Can you say something about why he went there?
Yes, he had a belief from childhood, I think, he wanted to do some service outside of Britain. He could have got a very comfortable living as a vicar given to him by his father in Holton. He chose not to do that, and instead of that he offered to be a missionary. He wanted to be a missionary and save the slaves of Africa. But because he'd had meningitis and tuberculosis as a child, the Missionary Society decided he needed to go to a more benign climate, and he was sent to Kashmir, which he'd never heard of, and he had to go to the Royal Geographical Society to find out where it was. And the other thing was that he was sent to be a school teacher, and his own family thought this was absolutely ridiculous because Cecil knew nothing, and how could he teach anybody else, especially as he couldn't learn another language because of his the disabilities caused by meningitis. So in a sense, going to Kashmir was quite accidental.
His approach was a bit like the Boy Scouts in a way, wasn't it?
Well, it was way ahead of the Boy Scouts, actually. It was about 20 years before Baden-Powell in the idea of boys at school serving other people. And in fact, they even wore the school badge so that people could see that they were available to do good deeds.
But Baden-Powell was in touch with him too. He may have learnt from him. Yeah.
Yes, they were quite, if you say, good friends in later life, and he used to exchange Christmas cards. I remember when I was a boy, the Christmas cards coming from Baden-Powell.
But it's today, much of this is politically incorrect stuff, isn't it?
Absolutely.
He dealt with reform.
Yes. Yeah. In fact, a lot of this I didn't know till I started doing this research. For instance, I had no idea of his attitude towards the Amritsar massacre, and nor of the attitude of the Church Missionary Society in Lahore, who applauded what had been done. It's extraordinary. And it's very difficult for us, I think, 100 years later, to understand how those sort of attitudes were quite acceptable. Similarly, beating the boys. But you know, I went to school where we got beaten, but we didn't. We actually were quite proud of the fact that we could show off our bruises.
Tell us about the Brahmins. He wanted the Brahmins to play football, right? The Brahmin young boys.
Yes, well...
and they didn't want to do this because they're not supposed to kick leather.
They're not supposed to touch leather, and they were not supposed to do work because they were the upper class. In fact, in the history of Kashmir, it's interesting that there were all the castes of Hindus in Kashmir until the Muslims came in about the 14th century, and they converted all the lower caste Hindus to Islam. But the Brahmins all retained their Hindu status, and they were the educated people and they were the privileged ones in society until 1989, when they were all driven out of the country.
So he felt that it was important for their character that they learn sports and that they play football, and when they didn't want to kick the footballs, he had them whacked by the masters.
That was the way he persuaded them, you might say. Yeah, but the interesting thing is he first of all had to get a corps of teachers who would do the jobs for him. And this is what I knew all these stories all my life, but I didn't realise that it all began in the first year. He managed to persuade a corps of young men, and they were some were Hindus, some were Muslims, and one was a Dogra, which is a different caste of Hindu, and they all were prepared to do what he was telling them to do against their religious requirements. And so there have been people who have criticised Biscoe for using Christians to beat up Hindus. That's not true at all. There were no Christians in there. They were all Hindus or Muslims themselves, but they were doing what he was asking them to do. And this is one of the things I would find myself really interesting, is what was the magic that he was able to use to change people and have them do things that their society said they shouldn't do.
And he didn't think that it was useful to have them become Christian, did he? He felt
not at all.
I was struck by that.
Actually, he used to have a notice outside in his garden gate, which said, the Reverend Tyndale-Biscoe will charges 1 rupee per minute to anybody who wishes to talk about Christianity. But if the conversation is favourable to the reverend gentleman, he will reduce the fee.
What did his missionary masters think of this?
They didn't like it at all. No. And that's another thing that I didn't realise until I read all the CMS records, that in fact the whole 50 years that he was there, he was never approved of properly by the CMS, the Church Missionary Society. And in fact, by 1928, they'd stopped paying any money to the school.
But one bishop respected him and made him a canon.
Well, that's right. That was Bishop Barnes, who was a different sort of person, and he reckoned that what Biscoe was doing in Kashmir was the best missionary work that the whole place was doing, even though he had no Christians.
But this is the struggle. I mean, it really is interesting, because you could sum up the negatives, and they're horrifying.
Yeah.
In fact, people said he gave us self-respect. He built the character out people. They loved him.
They did, and they still do. I mean, I've quoted a few people there. The one that really got me started on this book was, I say in the foreword, is when our taxi driver fell over dead, unconscious, and I'd learned how to do CPR at CSIRO, so of course I got down and started puffing air into his mustachioed mouth and beating his chest, and none of it worked. And took him and then the other taxi drivers took him to a local surgery, where the doctor said, he died in your care, so I must report you to the police. And I said, oh gosh. And then he said, may I know your name? And I said, Biscoe. He said, Biscoe? You are related to Canon Biscoe? And I said, yes, he was my grandfather. Oh, Canon Biscoe, he was a great man, your grandfather. He taught us to help other people. Have a good holiday. And that was 30 years after the guy died.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what really started me on this. I thought, what was this? What was it about this man who was appalling? Many of his politics were appalling. I wouldn't dream of supporting him. And when he goes into the fort and biffs the CEO in the stomach, I mean, with no provocation at all, but because he's British, he can get away with it.
Yeah, and was admired for it. I'm not primarily an India specialist, but I mean the way in which Hegel talked about India, a country, people living in a dream, static, otherworldly India. That's not it's more Amartya Sen's India, which are the argumentative India, the combative India.
Yes.
I kept thinking, is he appealing to that side of India, that the confrontational, dialogic debate all the time? I mean, he's pushing people. There's something dynamic about the situation.
Yes,
I'm trying to think why they accepted this sort of bullying, whereas my assumption would have been that they would be far more comfortable with people like Andrews or people like the missionary who was there before him, or Annie Besant.
Well, my thinking, I've sort of thought quite a bit of this about this, and it strikes me that one of the problems with the Kashmiris is they live in a beautiful valley, and this I'm specifically meaning Kashmir, not the state, which has got a lot of other bits and pieces, but Kashmir Valley is a beautiful valley, and the people who lived there the history goes back at least 2,000 years, and there have been civilizations in Kashmir. They generally are peaceful people and very artistic. This picture up here is a part of an embroidered shawl which is in the National Gallery of Australia. And in fine detail, it depicts the city of Srinagar in 1870. And you can pick out individual features of the city on it. And that sort of, they had great skill in craft, and they were very learned people. Pandit, a Brahmin Pandit, is a learned man. And my grandfather was not a learned man at all. And he could never learn to speak either Kashmiri or Urdu in his whole life, because he had, his brain had probably been affected by meningitis as a boy, and he'd lost one lung, so he was always weak. So his approach to it was a much more ordinary one, I suppose. But what he did,
it was practical, and it was focused all the time on reform. Yet they loved him.
Yeah, well, I lost my point, my train of thought. What I was going to say was, because they were peaceful people and that sort, they were always being invaded by warlike people, and all through the city, the history of Kashmir,
and he was the latest
Kashmiris
example.
have always been bullied by more warlike people. First of all, it was the Mughals, then it was the Sikhs, the Afghans, then the Sikhs, then the Dogras. Each lot come in and they bully the Kashmiris into subjection. And the Kashmiris had learnt the only way to survive is to be cringing and cowardly and sneaky. And so they had a really bad reputation by everybody. And he gave them self-respect, and I think that's the magic of of his whole thing. That he said, no, you can do great things. And the football and the boating and climbing were really only there to give them that self-respect.
So he was, in one sense, in a tradition of bullying foreigners, because they'd had bullies one after the other.
They'd had bullies before.
But this one actually wanted them, bully them into standing up, in fact.
Yes.
Because it comes through a lot in his writing all the time. It's character. I want these people to have a backbone. Is that right?
That's
I
right.
want to put their point of view strongly.
But he was also, in a sense, his writing reflected that. And that's why, one of the reasons why, when I decided to do this, I decided I wanted to get away from his own writing and find out what the background of all this was. Yeah. Because in his own writing, he always won everything. Every battle he had was always, he ended up winning. and people don't.
He'd been a boxer, hadn't he?
But it was even with but he learned boxing at school because he was about to be he was at one of these English boarding schools, these fine boarding schools, and he was going to be raped by the older boys, and he managed to get an arm or something of this older boy and bit him so furiously that he saved his virtue, and then decided he'd got to do better than this, and he went to an old sergeant in the school drill thing and said, "Teach me how to box," and he did, but in teaching him he knocked his nose crooked, so all his life he had this crooked nose through boxing.
Yep.
And it's there on the picture. So,
can we have some questions or comments, and then we want to, at the end of this, come back to some comments from you about the book. And
yes.
Sure.
You refer to your grandfather all the way through as Biscoe, yet his name was Tyndale-Biscoe. Why did you refer to him as Biscoe and not by his full name?
Well, that's part of the reason, Dennis, is what I've just said, that I was trying to get away from the persona that I grew up with and which I was too closely associated with. And also, he was never known as Tyndale-Biscoe in Kashmir. Even to this day, he's always known as Canon Biscoe. And the boys of the school, which we heard a message from polarised coal, they call themselves Biscoans to this day. They don't call themselves Tyndale-Biscoans. And so I thought, to get away from this being a hagiography, I'm just going to use the simple name and always his surname and hardly ever his first name to try and make it a bit more impersonal. So that was why. And as you said to me, you would certainly have been a Biscoe boy.
Thank you very much for the talk so far. It's very interesting. Have you or your father or your grandfather ever been to the grave that's purported to be of Jesus Christ, which is
yes, I know about that. Yes, there is a mosque. There is a mosque in Srinagar city, which has a writing that this is the tomb of Jesus Christ. But there's a problem, archaeological problem with that, because when Jesus was crucified, and may have survived, was 2,000 years ago, and at that time in Kashmir, the whole country was Buddhist. There were no Muslims. And so there wouldn't have been a Muslim mosque to which he could have been taken. I know it's not clear really what's the origin of this thing, but I don't think it has any historical basis.
Hold on a second.
Thank you.
You've spoken about your desire to have some objectivity.
Yes.
But I can't help wondering what was your relationship with your grandfather? What are your memories, and what did you have to either set aside or work through, or whatever you chose to do with it?
I had very good relationships with him. I knew him very well because I knew him until I was 15. And after I left Kashmir, I continued to correspond with him on a fairly regular basis, about probably maybe once every 2 months. He and I would write very short letters, and until the last year of his life, really.
So, as a grandfather,
yes,
what are your memories of him as a grandfather?
Well, by the time I came around, he was in his 70s, and he was a much more benign than the person that one reads about in the early days. And he had a wonderful sense of humour, so he was always laughing, and going to his house was always a pleasure. And he let me rummage around in his study. I found all sorts of little treasures that he'd collected in Ladakh, and I've still got them. And so he had a strong impression on me as a boy, and it went on through life. And when I finished university, I had this feeling it's my responsibility to go back to Kashmir and continue school in the schools. So I wrote to the principal at the time and said, "Is there a job for me in Kashmir?" And he was by this stage had fallen out with the Indian authorities because he was favouring Pakistan, and he said, "Well, I'm going over to Pakistan. Why don't you come with me to Pakistan, to Peshawar?" So I did, and I had 3 years sort of in my grandfather's and my father's footsteps. But at the end of that time, I wanted to get back to science, and so it was a wonderful time, but it wasn't my career.
Your grandfather wanted you to actually teach there, didn't he? He'd hoped you would. And your father did, didn't he?
Well, my father followed my grandfather, and he had I think, a bad treatment from his father, because he never really gave him the full authority, although he was de facto running the school. When I was born, my grandfather announced a whole holiday for the schools, and the third principal of the mission school has been born. So, you know, I grew up with this sort of semi-royalty notion. But and when I was a boy, I did all the things that he approved of. I swam across the lakes, and I boxed, and I climbed mountains, all the things that he approved of. So I was much influenced. And I was probably a bloody little prig, because I used to go around saying, "My grandfather's a great man," you know.
Like Tony, I found myself actively disliking your grandfather because of his attitudes of using corporal punishment and trying to bully people into being better citizens.
Yeah.
But partway through the book, you wrote something which was quite powerful, and that was Biscoe was a man of his time, and we're looking back at from a different time, with a different set of circumstances. But you also said the same thing about your father, because they were diametrically opposed about India's independence.
Yeah.
And that this was a sort of loggerheads thing. But and they were a different generation, obviously, because of that. And that set me thinking about your grandfather and saying, well, I can't look through the lens of my lens. I have to try and look at the lens of the time. Yeah. And then I realised that he actually was an amazing man.
I think so. There were actually a number of missionaries of his generation who were amazing people, but most of them were medical missionaries, and they did wonderful work before there was really any public hospitals or medicine. And I've mentioned one or two. Arthur Neve did terrific work, and Henry Holland also, but he was more in the Pakistan part of the country. But there are many others like them. And my original idea was I was going to try and write a much more ambitious book of all the missionaries who had worked in Kashmir, and their relationship with the Maharajas, their relationship with the British resident who was de facto was the ruler of Kashmir. But I was persuaded away from that by a writer in New Zealand, Kath Beattie, and also by Marina, who both said, you're taking on far too much, and you'll just write a great big stodgy textbook. and you're much better to concentrate on one person and write from that person's point of view. So having collected all this other stuff at the CMS archives and so on, I then thought, well, I've got more on Tyndale-Biscoe than I've got on anybody else. So, and I know I've got all his diaries and everything else and correspondence, so I'd better write a book about him. But I thought I didn't want to write a hagiography because they're not very interesting. And although my cousin has been telling me that that's what I should be doing, but so I've tried to write something which is more dispassionate, more scientific, if you like, the study of one male primate.
That's a very, very good line. Look, can I just say, I didn't dislike. I just can't make up my mind. I mean, that's what makes one read on. When I began reading, and I'm reading about an area I don't know much about, and I'm pushing myself. After a few pages, I didn't at all. I mean, it draws you forward. You just can't decide where you stand. And I sort of think it's not entirely a question of a person of his time, because other missionaries were different. I mean, there were missionaries like Andrews and what's his name, the man before him, Knowles and so forth, who were different. And but I can't help thinking there's some sort of dilemma in all of this, some contradiction that actually matters to us now. Well,
I'd like to say, I think that, as I've said, Tyndale-Biscoe is a man of his time. And that applies to a number of other things. There's an incident I've got there where the governor of the Punjab was intending to hang 20 men for sedition. Now, these were people who were complaining that they had 70, over 1 million Indians had fought in France and the Middle East in the First World War. 70,000 had died. And then at the end of the war, the British said, no, you can't have independence. And so there was an outrage. But my grandfather was one of the people who thought, of course they shouldn't have independence. They're not ready for it, and they won't ever be ready for it. And the governor of the Punjab decided that he was going to hang 20 of these seditious people. And my grandfather met the viceroy at the time when this was happening, and the viceroy asked him what he thought he should do, and they decided that he should only hang 4 of them. So, you know, this is it's a relative thing. We'll leave it. And then if I go back a bit further, go back to the first Maharaja of Kashmir, the way he dealt with discipline was he publicly removed the scalp off the person, and it's known as flaying alive. And that was his form of punishment. And John Nicholson, the hero of Delhi, thought it was a jolly good idea. So we live in a different age.
Thank you very much for that. It's extremely interesting. But I'm sort of coming back to earth, as it were, and want to ask you a question about the school. I mean, I'm very impressed that it still has 7,000 plus students.
Yes.
And I was wondering if it's a sort of established practice that there are schools that were founded by British or Irish still existing, and I'm thinking, of course, of Henry Lawrence's schools, the Lawrence schools,
yes.
Which probably, started out as looking out for
Henry
orphans.
Lawrence was, of course, the governor of the Punjab.
I was going to make that
hero.
point.
Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
At the point he was on the board of governors when the Punjab was straight after it was annexed, and he was around when the Kohinoor diamond was removed.
Yeah.
But his schools are thriving still, and I was wondering if there are others.
Well, I think I give a lot of credit to Parvez Cole, the present principal, and his wife Joyce. They've done a marvellous job, and they've been there now for 30 years. And he is the first Kashmiri to run that school. I mean, it was run by English foreigners until him. And he is a Christian. His grandfather, I think, converted to Christianity, but but originally they were Kashmiri Brahmins. So he is a Kashmiri. And when he was appointed, a lot of Kashmiris said, "Oh, that's a terrible thing they've appointed him, because we'll never be able to get round him, because he knows us too well." And he has, and he's been incredibly successful in keeping the school, but it has become an upper class school rather than a school for the poor, which my grandfather always advocated.
As have the Lawrence schools.
Yeah, they all do, and they have in Australia too. All the church schools have become the swank schools, haven't they?
But can I just say that all over India, those schools are still thriving.
Yeah.
Lama Timyer in Lucknow, Bishop Cotton in Simla. You must have been at Edwards College, I think, in Peshawar. Yes.
I taught there.
Yes.
Yeah.
They're all going strong.
Yeah. Yeah.
But they are more pure.
Yes. Well, one of the advantages, I think, is the Tyndale-Biscoe school in Kashmir. The advantage is they teach in the medium of English from kindergarten right through to the end of school, and those children are fluent in English. Marina and I were there in 2007, and we attended meetings with the boys and the girls, and the girls were they had debates. One of the debates was something. Do you remember, Marina, what it was? The debate that why do we need to have outside coaching? And one of these girls got up and said, "It's because the teaching isn't good enough in the school." Joe, what a thing. You know, a Kashmiri girl standing up and speaking like that would never have happened in the past. And so in a sense, being fluent in English is a huge advantage in India if you want your children to get on. And so I think that's one of the main advantages of these schools. As I said, there are 4 schools, three schools for boys and 1 for girls.
Hi, Hugh. One of the things I was wondering about is what it was like for Biscoe's wife. That says I wonder.
Yes, a very good question. I think we'll get the next one.
The next one was going to be that.
It's extraordinary. I tried to find stuff about my grandmother, and I could find nothing. He met her when she was 18. As far as I know, they hardly saw each other again until she went out to India, and she got off the ship and she was married that day to this man who. And in the photos, the group photos of the missionaries of that time, she looks terribly frightened. I feel really sorry for her. She seemed as though she'd been pitchforked into something she knew nothing about. But she was a strong character, and she held her family together when he basically neglected his children. And I've indicated that in one state. I've read into what happened, that he wanted her to stay with him in Kashmir while their 3 boys were at boarding school in England, and she wasn't going to see them for 4 or 5 years, and she just up and went to England. Said, "No, you can teach your boys here. I'm going to be with my boys in England." And then, of course, the First World War came, and so she was there when they came back on leave from the front. And so she was a strong woman, but like so many women, she was sort of written out of the story. Mm.
Can you wait for it, though?
Thank you. What influence did his presence in Kashmir have on the lives of Hindu and Muslim women?
What effect did the school have?
Yeah,
What did he do for women?
Yeah, well, I think that was probably one of the greatest achievements that he made, you've got to be careful in saying he made, because in fact he could never have done anything without the people, the Hindu teachers. It was the Hindu teachers, encouraged by his ideas, who fought first of all to get the age of marriage of girls raised from about 8 to 14, and in a couple of steps. So that took a huge battle to start with, but the young Maharaja Hari Singh, the new Maharaja Hari Singh, that was one of the bravest things he did, because he opposed the Hindu establishment in support of raising the marriage age of girls, and I've described that in the book. But the other, probably the more important thing, was to break down the custom, which was very old, not only in Kashmir but in India as well, that a Hindu widow could never marry again. Because in the past, the Hindu widows were expected to go to their husband's funeral pyre and die on it in what's called sati. But the British made that illegal in British India, and the first Maharaja, Gulab Singh, made it illegal in Kashmir, at least his son did. His wives were going to be burnt on his pyre, but it didn't happen, and that was the end of sati. But it wasn't the end of misery for young widows, because there was no future for a young widow except in her dead husband's family. And so her life really was, she was a slave in that household. She had no value except as a servant and as a handy prostitute, if you like, for the other men in the house. And if those women had children, if they produced a baby, that was a terrible shame. So the baby was killed at birth and dropped into the Jhelum River. And my grandfather said he remembers when the weir at the bottom end of the city was raised, he'd see all these dead babies trapped in the weir. So, he tried to get that stopped. And initially, the Hindu establishment was totally opposed at him meddling with their customs. And he realised that the only way he could ever do this was through the masters in the school. And in 1928, they managed to get the first Hindu widow remarried in full Hindu rites by Hindus, and there wasn't a single missionary anywhere in sight at that wedding. It was done by the Kashmiri Hindus themselves, and so, of course, it stuck, and it ended up by eventually becoming law that a Hindu widow had the right to remarry. So that was. In fact, it was very early. It was before Catherine Mayo's book, Mother India, exposed this whole thing in India and caused a lot of furor there.
He sometimes won out, didn't he, against missionaries, or, I mean, like Annie Besant, in fact, herself, who were much more accepting of Hindu customs, but the Maharaja, he got him on side, right? So the chief had to put an end to his schools, but he was backed by the Maharaja. Yeah. But why? Why did he win out there? Because that's quite an achievement, isn't it?
Yes, I don't know. My book has been read by the previous principal to Parvez, who was John Ray. And one of the comments John Ray made, because he was there for 25 years, and he said, "I'm interested in your trying to explain Kashmir customs. As you know, it's very difficult to find the truth in these stories. So I don't know really what the truth is in some of these things." The Maharaja said that Mr. Biscoe's been here for 10 years and now he's done nothing but good. I'm not going to kick him out of the country. there was a story that my grandfather used to tell the story, because Annie Besant was one of his serious enemies and caused his nervous breakdown. And he used to say that Annie Besant was in favour with the Maharaja, with the second Pratap Singh, who'd had difficulty getting a son born to his Maharanis. And Annie Besant came up to Kashmir, and lo and behold, his wife produced a son. So, of course, everybody said, well, it was Annie Besant's influence that caused this beneficent thing. And then my grandfather says, but 3 or 4 years later, the unfortunate son died, and Annie Besant's influence declined substantially, because he said, well, you know, if she can get a son, surely she can keep him alive.
That's his argumentative style.
Yes, it was.
We should bring this to a close, but first, Hugh, this isn't a book launching, it's a book event, isn't it, really? But you need to say something to finish about the book.
Yes, I just want to say that a lot of people, of course, have helped me through this, and I've acknowledged them in the book. But I really want to thank my own family. Nikki has read a lot of it and helped me a lot. And the opening blurb of the book was her words, and Sally made a comment that she seldom sees blurbs which are as well presented as that one by Nikki. And Paul was the person who suggested the name. So both of them have a part, and unfortunately neither of them could be here. And Marina has had a profound effect on me and on this book. She's been with me all through it. We've been to Kashmir 4 times. We've chased archives down in South India. And she's done this while she was in fact writing and editing her own parents' memoirs of their wartime life in Czechoslovakia, which she published as a lovely book called Horka, A Home That Was, Surviving Czechoslovakia 1936 to 49. So thank you, Marina, for everything, and for being here today as well.
I thought Marina pushed you forward in the way Cecil would have. Get that book finished, Hugh.
I don't know about that, but I think Marina realises that TBs are rather difficult people to live with. My father wasn't an easy person to live with, my grandfather obviously wasn't, and she thinks that some of the genes have run through.
And now I hope that you'll all remain with us and just give us a few minutes while we stack up chairs and things. And there's food and drinks at the back. I mean, not real drinks, tea and coffee and other sort of drinks. You have to come at night here to get alcohol. Okay. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you both so much for that lovely, lovely conversation.
But you always are, don't you?
Hello, Marie. Hi.
Are we going to do this illegally?
No, why is it illegal?
Oh, that right. How did you vote for me? Oh, I sent that to you, didn't I?
You did?
Yeah.
So you have to...
So where do you want me to write? There?
Yeah, yes, and the date, please, as well.
No. Brain, get Brain to me.
Brain is
Laura, yes.
Oh, Laura. Yes. Very good. There you are. And the date, please.
Okay. That apparently.
We missed your talk because we thought it was at 3 o'clock.
Oh.
But it was at 2. We are just freshly arrived from Timor. And apparently your son... Yeah. We are together.
Yeah.
And you have a son in Timor Rogers about the fall of Uganda.
She was sort of live came on that. I'm glad you're glad. Thanks very much. Adrian's interested in